Welcome to episode 13 of Two Pastors and a Plant. We don't even really have a title question for this yet, so we're just going to, I don't have a script. I normally have sort of a script. We're just going to continue what we were talking about in the previous episode. And again, I just want to clarify, this is June 16th, so we're talking about these issues. It's probably going to be, 2 weeks from now before this.
Could be very out of date.
Before we upload this this video. So we're going to just kind of continue that conversation we had from last week. I'd encourage you to watch episode 12 if you missed it. But the topic of conversation, I guess, is not really a question, but in light of the recent protests around the country, what's our response to that? How do we see these protests going on nationally, and then we'll talk about locally here in a second.
Sure. Well, first of all, I think as an American, one of our most treasured rights is the ability to assemble, to petition our government, to peaceably assemble, to protest. And so I think it would be un-American to begrudge somebody their right to do so, to protest legally, to apply for a permit, and as has happened here in Oxford, and protest. And I can't emotionally, because I'm white, and given my history, I just can't emotionally go where a lot of black Americans are going. I'm sympathetic to it because, as we talked about in the previous episode, there has been de jure, under the color of law, racism in our country for the vast majority of its history up until just a few decades ago. So I talk to my black friends, and they tell me their experiences, but then they tell me what their parents and grandparents have told them about what life was like not that long ago. And so there's anger, and there's frustration, and they see a video like what happened to George Floyd, and they just want it to stop. So I'm sympathetic to people who protest over these types of things. I'm not sympathetic to rioting and looting. That's illegal. That vandalism, that's illegal. But the irony of it is a lot of the folks doing the damage in these protests nationwide are white people. And my black friends that I'm talking to, and then some of the black protesters on the news, they're furious that these white guys are the ones coming in burning down didn't they say in the precinct in Minneapolis it was a white guy that did it. So they're not any more happy about that than I am. But one thing about the protests that makes it difficult is, compared especially to the civil rights movement, is that during the civil rights movement you had national leadership, I think in a way that right. You don't have now. Yeah. And they had specific agenda, the right to vote, end segregated schooling, things like that. Right. And there's very little or there has been, at least up until this point, very little agreement about what people are protesting for, because you've got Black Lives Matter protesters, and I think it should be said that Black Lives Matter.
For sure.
Period.
Absolutely.
The organization Black Lives Matter, that's a different story. They've got an atheistic, very left-wing agenda that I don't agree with. I don't think a Christian can agree with. But the phrase Black Lives Matter is not something any white Christians should be afraid of. But they've got an agenda, and then you've got Marxists in the movement who are trying to do an overthrow of the government. You've got economic issues. Nobody really knows exactly what they're protesting when they come to these protests. Not everybody agrees. Whereas in the civil rights movement, I think there was pretty broad agreement
goals
as to what they were trying to accomplish. Yeah. So that makes it difficult. That's why I did not personally want to march in Oxford last week, because I wasn't sure what in the world they were going to march for. I want to support, obviously, the notion, the biblical notion that every single human being, there's only one race, the human race, different ethnicities, but only one race, and every single member of the human race should be treated with dignity and respect, no matter the color of their skin. But there were a lot of signs of that march that said defund the police. And I just can't go along with that, not in Oxford, Mississippi, because I think we're doing a pretty good job I think the police is doing a pretty good job. So that makes it difficult to know how to respond to the protests because some people are protesting one thing, some are the other. Some people just like to get out and feel self-righteous because look at me, I'm protesting. That makes it more difficult. But more locally, we've got other issues other than just the protest itself.
Well, yeah, and we kind of get to, I guess if I can step back into this, just sort of, how we can lovingly agree and disagree on certain issues and not impugn motives on each other for, just because you say you don't, support defund the police, as you just said, doesn't mean you don't support the idea that Black Lives Matter.
Right.
And it's really hard today to...
And there's not even agreement on what defund the police means among
Yeah.
different protesters. So.
And so it's, I guess, how do we, with great wisdom, navigate disagreements on issues like this?
Well, again, the first thing is you don't have to speak your opinion.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a reason why we waited weeks to talk about this. And I mentioned this in the previous episode. I think it's Proverbs 29:20. Do you see a man who speaks in haste? There's more hope for a fool than for him. So just don't feel like you have to engage with everybody. Talk to the people you love. Talk to people you care about. Hopefully that includes people of different ethnicities. Talk to people in your church. But just realize there's really limited usefulness in going on Twitter and Facebook and posting your opinion. Probably you're only going to whip up the people who are already angry about it on either side, and you're not going to change anybody's minds. So I think that's just important to say over and over again. That's not, I think a loving way to respond is to reach out to the people whom you know, pray with your church, and work locally, act locally. Be informed globally, but act locally. That's just what I'd want to do that. And then the second thing I'd say is this. It is very easy for me as a minister to open up the Bible and tell an individual that racism is wrong.
Right.
Very easy. I can go all over the New Testament and say, in one sense, the story of the New Testament is that there is now one people under God. It's not the Jewish people anymore, and it certainly ain't just the white people. It never was just the white people, by the way. It is all, every tribe, every tongue, every people, every nation. But to extrapolate out and say, now, and as a result of that, this is how we must act as a nation, and these are the policies that Congress must pass. And these are the executive orders that our president must sign. I don't have the wisdom to tell my church how to vote, or my congressman or my representative that this is what a biblical stand on this particular issue looks like. I'm not saying that I don't have opinions, but I think they are opinions. It's not something I want to sound from the pulpit. So that's another thing that makes the protest difficult is not only is there not a unified voice about what the protesters want, it's that it's hard to even know biblically exactly what policies to enact. But having said that, that's not an excuse to do nothing. And like I said in the previous episode, we had a chance, some of the leadership in this church had a chance to meet with our mayor and our chief of police, and it went great. They're doing an outstanding job. And to act locally and just make sure the policies that we felt needed to be in place, turns out they were already in place and had been in place for years in Knoxville, Mississippi. They don't do chokeholds and strangleholds here, haven't for a long, long time. So that's how I'd want to advise just thoughtful, prayerful, careful, prudent response to these issues.
Something we've talked about in both these episodes is sort of ways to love. And the best way you mentioned in your sermon last week, this is June 16th, so listening. And it's something that we should all do and consider, that maybe our ideas that we have in our head aren't all right. And so we can listen to people that have different backgrounds and different families they were raised in. And that's one easy way we can all do, obviously locally and with our friends and family, to listen to people that have different experiences, something we've talked about a couple times.
Shylyn's article in the Gospel Coalition, I don't know Shylyn personally, but I think reading that article is a good example of what a lot of black people would say if you're white, that would help you understand and kind of get in their shoes, why they're reacting the way they do to the death of George Floyd.
I think that's all the time we have for this episode. Possibly going to get into another one here in episode 14, but thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week.